In this video I want to show a fun grouping, and I also want to show some theory behind grouping. I want to provide some evidence for a hypothesis I have about grouping, which we'll get to later. In my dataset I have fruits, I have some duplicates like pineapple, an apricot, and then I have some fruits that contain a Danish character. I want to do a grouping where duplicates are in the same group, and I want the Danish characters to be in the same group. And I solved this using two methods, and the third didn't work, but the way it didn't work helps provide evidence for my hypothesis. Before going further, I want to show a neat little trick that you need to be aware of with grouping, which is relevant when you do a grouping on one column. When you do a group, you can either provide the key as a list or a column, meaning when you do a group on one column, you can either do it as a list or text, and it has slightly different behavior. I want to do a grouping on table fruits. Let's start by providing the key as a value. Then my aggregation column is simply going to be, I want to do a count, which is then table row count. And I don't have to write each because this function innately acts upon the table. And then I can add type also. I want to do a global grouping. You don't have to be explicit, but I'm choosing to be here. And then I can provide my own comparer. It is going to compare the current group to the next value. And this will become relevant later on when I want to show my hypothesis. For now, I simply want to use the value compare, which is going to compare the value of the current row to the next row. And because I provided the column as a text, I can simply input current, next here in value compare. Then it's going to do the grouping. Because behind the scenes, when you refer to the current value and the next value, it actually says the current row says value in the fruits column because you've only provided that column. If we instead provide the column as a list, like so, this means that the current and next actually refer to the whole row, but not the whole row, only the columns you provided in the list. Which means I have to specify that I want to go into the current row or current group sys fruit column, and the same with the next row. Otherwise the setup is the same, but you need to be aware of this. This becomes relevant when you want to create your own grouper, as we will later, where you might have different behavior on column 1 and another behavior on a second column, which we will do. In my first solution, I want to use a helper column, which is going to check whether the column contains a Danish character, and if so, it outputs the word Danish, and if it doesn't contain a Danish character, then I want to output the value itself. Then we use that column to group with, meaning I want to add a new column upon the table fruits called contains Danish, and that's going to be where I want to use list matches any, because I don't care which of the Danish characters it contains, as long as it contains one of them. The comparison I want to do is to take my text and split that into the individual characters, then compare each character to each character of the list of Danish characters. This is what list.matchesAny does. It does a comparison on each value where I need to provide the list, which is then going to be the text, which has been converted into a list using the convenient text to list function. I'm going to convert the fruits column into a text, and then I want to apply the function upon this list, which is going to be list.Contains, where I then want to go through my list of Danish characters, compare that to the underscore, which is then the list version of the fruit value, and then I want to ignore case, because then I don't have to write the characters in capital case and in small case. And then if this condition is true, then I want to output Danish, otherwise I want to output the value. And then we can also add type. Now we see apple, I don't know what that is actually, coconut, that is Danish. And we can then do a basic grouping. Because we already have the column, we can simply go into transform and do the grouping. Then I want to do count, and I want to add all, because then we can check the values. We can see here in the Danish group that we have all these values. Then you might want to do a new column where you concatenate all these texts, which we'll do later. We can also solve this problem with a local grouping, and this requires you already have sorted your data. If you're able to get sorted data on the column you want to group on, then this solution is better. But in my case, I shouldn't use that, because when you sort, you have to compare the whole table, whereas with the helper column, you just have to add a new value where you use the current row. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I need to do a two-tiered sort, where I have my fruits with a Danish character at the top and the non-Danish characters at the bottom, and afterwards I then need to sort ascendingly, because this is necessary for the local grouping. It requires that your table has been sorted. So we will do almost the same logic, except I put that inside of table sort instead. So I want to sort a table fruits, and then I provide a list, because I have to do a two-tiered sort. I want to say if list matches any, and again text to list on the fruits column. Again, I want to say each list contains my list, comma underscore, comma ignore case. And then if this is true, that is, if my text contains a Danish character, then I want to output 0, otherwise 1. And this will create the first tier. So all the Danish characters are at the top and the non-Danish at the bottom. And this is because table sort behind the scenes uses a number to do a sort. So now we have basically a list where you first have either the value 0 or 1. And then in the second layer, I will simply use the fruit column to sort it. So now we have blueberries, which are before raspberries, which are before strawberries. And this is of course Danish, so the words are a bit different. In any case, we now have the sorting, which means I can do a local grouping. I need to take care of two things. I need to handle the transition between Danish characters to non-Danish characters, and I need to handle when the two rows are actually the same, because then apricot and apricot need to be grouped together. So it is a bit complex, but fortunately you get the solution. I want to do my grouping on the previous step, which was called sort and local, and my key is then the fruit column, and I'm going to pass that in as a list, but I don't have to. And then my aggregation column is going to be all, which is simply the nested table. And then I want to do a combine. I want to combine the values of the grouping. Which means I want to use Text.Contains, grab the value in the fruit column, and then concatenate that using a comma space. And then we have to put a comma here. The group kind is local. And then I need to provide my function. And this is also why I wanted to show that columns list versus not list. So we want to say current group, comma next. I want to say if the values are identical, then I want to output a 0. And the way local groups work is that when the comparison function outputs a 0, then the row gets added to the current group. And if it's a 1, then the new row becomes its own group. It means you only have to compare the current group to the next row. And if this isn't the case, which is where we have to handle this transition, we can then say another if statement. And then we copy the logic as before. List matches any, text to list, my fruit. Actually, I need to specify it should be in the next row because we're looking at the transition. Then I say, again, list contains my list, comma underscore, comma ignore case. If this is true, that is, the next row also contains a Danish character, then I want to output 0, otherwise 1, which means in the transition from apple to apricot, well, the apricot doesn't contain a Danish character, so it should be a new group. Then if I minded my parentheses, then everything is fine. Actually, I do want to add type here. Actually, that was too early. It shouldn't be in Text.Contains, it should be in the list. Now it works. And here, as I mentioned, now we have the combination. We don't have any duplicates with the Danish characters, but that would be covered with this condition too, so they would be stored in the same group. You might want to do a change here, where you actually don't want to add the new column as part of the group, but instead you reference the column, because then you can remove duplicates if this is something you'd want. Otherwise you could have, like here, you have duplicates, and you might not want that. But we can now move on to my support for the binary search hypothesis, and what this means is that when you do a grouping, my hypothesis is that Power Query will basically create a sorted list behind the scenes, similar to what we did here, except in ascending order, and then it will take the value and compare it to the middle value and then say, is my value greater than or less than, and then it will divide the table into two. And then if my value is less than the middle value, then it either has to be unique or it has to find a match in the first half. And then it will again compare to the halfway point and keep going until it finds the same value, or the function realizes that the new value is unique, so it has to create a new group. It's going to make more sense when we look at the code, and it is similar to the local grouping, but we do have to make some changes. I'll write it from fresh. Still want to do a group on typical fruits on the fruits column. I want to do a row count, and I don't have to provide the underscore in the each because the function is implicitly applied upon the nested table. And then I also want to add that combiner column. And then I wanted to do a global group, and my comparison is then going to be current comma next goes towards, and this is where it gets a bit wonky. I want to say if list matches any, as we've seen before. I want to convert the current grouping into a text. Then I want to say list contains, as we've already seen. So if the current row has a Danish character, and then I need to check if the next row has a Danish character. And now the indentation might be a bit difficult to follow along. And I have to check if the next row also has a Danish character. And if that is the case, then I want to output 0. Otherwise, then I simply want to do a value compare between the current fruit and the next fruit, because this handles the duplicates as we had with pineapple. Then I added a few too many arguments, so I messed up some parentheses. And that is because this needs to be a list of lists, and then it's fine. Now we get apricot and pineapple, and that is expected. But here we have raspberry, I think, and then we have 6 rows with Danish characters, and then we have strawberry on its own. And that's a bit weird. So why is it that raspberry, I think it is on its own, and strawberry is on its own? That is difficult to answer. And we also see that apple ends up being the first row that we use in the grouping. But what I think happens behind the scenes, which is why I say it's evidence of the binary search hypothesis, is that I think behind the scenes, Power Query will actually ignore my function here, and it will simply say, okay, you provided the column fruits, so I'm going to go into the fruits column and sort that, and then I'm going to take the current row's value and compare that to all the unique values, which is then iteratively created. So when the first row we add apricots as a unique value, then we add pineapple as a unique value, and then we keep going. And then if we check the table, we can see that actually strawberry is the second value with a Danish character, but then we have apple as the second. So we first add pineapple as a row, then strawberry, then raspberry, then passion fruit, then apple. And then when we get down here, we try to see if brombær should be unique or it should belong to another group. And then I guess it ends up being compared to apple, and I can't explain why. It might be because Power Query does a culture sensitive comparison. So it thinks that the Danish A is equal to an A and an E. So the B of brombær gets compared to the A of apple, and then they get grouped together because both contain a Danish character, and then it keeps going. So it ends up being very wonky, which means that the conclusion to this video is that when you want to do some fancier groups, where you actually do a function rather than doing a literal comparison, then I would unfortunately recommend adding a helper column, because that actually gives you the results you want, even though I hate adding a column just to do one operation and then deleting it. But I think unfortunately it's necessary, unless you know that the data is sorted, and then you can do the local grouping, because then it only compares the current group to the next row rather than comparing the current value to all other groups. So unfortunately, I think this is the correct solution. In any case, that was it. So